Chapter 36. Joan 1. Joan smiled down at them from atop her horse. Since she wasn't using her own strength to move, it made it difficult for Lionel to get a reading on her stats. He almost felt that there was something in her smile that said she was doing it on purpose. On the other hand, Lionel felt that he was reading into it too much. The moment he saw Joan, other than being stricken by her beauty, he instantly remembered the fact that he was meant to kill this woman eventually. Lionel sighed inwardly. Maybe it was easier to paint her out as some evil mastermind now so he could more easily do what needed to be done in the future. Quite frankly, Lionel was unsure how the bosses of a zone was decided. Were they always bad people? He wasn't certain of that. He only had one sample to pull his conclusion from. However, if he purely used the reason why they entered zones to draw his conclusion A, to deal with instances of higher dimensions touching their timeline before they should die, then the logical answer was no. They weren't always bad people, It was very possible that Joan's only crime was being ahead of her time, awakening abilities before she should have died. In such a case, Lionel found he had taken a leap head first into yet another dilemma. Forgive me for not stepping down from my horse to greet you personally. I took an arrow to the thigh in my previous battle, and am unable to walk under my own power currently. Hearing these words, Lionel felt even worse about his previous thoughts. History did speak about Joan being injured on multiple occasions. The fact she came out to greet them and even swung up to sit on her horse in such a state made her more than worthy of praise. It only made it more difficult now that he remembered that in this year, she was actually his Idjaw. She had recaptured Orleans at just 17 years old. By now, she was like 18. We take no offense, Lady Joan. Please excuse my companion, she cannot speak. We've humbly come to be your aid. Cannot speak French, and please do not call me a lady, I am no noble. Joan giggled a light, airy laughter. I'm certain that you are in the eyes of many, Lionel said with a smile. My companion has been a mute since her birth. Our family believes that this may have been the price to pay in exchange for our ability, sir. Lionel spoke of the story he and Ina had decided upon. Of course, he embellished a bit, adding a hint of superstition common in this era. Right. Of course, this story assumes that he and Ina are brother and sister. In truth, on the surface, this isn't so easy to accept. Lionel had too many Hispanic features, while Ina herself was more Northern European. However, Lionel knew that in such a situation, over-explaining would be more eyebrow-raising. People tended to fill in the blanks themselves. As expected, Joan paused for a moment, but seeing that Lionel didn't intend to explain, she accepted it in stride. I see. I hope there comes a day when your sister recovers then. I am very interested by these abilities of yours, though. Can you tell me more? Even we do not know much. Lionel was sure to answer without holding any hesitation in his voice. He wanted to appear as though he trusted Joan completely and had no reservations about telling her everything. We only know that we are stronger, faster, and quicker than others by a large margin. We can only call it an act of God. When we heard of your exploits, we felt that you were no better person to sympathize with us. Lionel felt that Joan's gaze softened slightly and her smile became more genuine. Like this, Lionel and Joan were ushered into Château Royal de Blois. Or rather, they were led to a holding in the outer castle. Castles were functionally cities within walls. They were separated into several layers, of which had their own walls for protection, usually offset so it was more difficult to charge through their gates in one go. It was actually already a privilege for Lionel and Ina to come this far. But it also seemed that they had to earn their keep very quickly, because not even a day later, a march toward Patay was announced. So it began, according to history. This will be Joan's final major victory. After this, King Charles will be crowned. She'll then fail to recapture Paris, before finally being captured in her battle for Compiègne. You say there are two more like you, Joan? Yes, my king. Because of them, we can move our battle for Patay up. According to General Frank, they all but annihilated an army of 20 strong by themselves, forcing them into a retreat. The brother in particular fought alone for half a day. Joan knelt before a throne with one arm across her chest and another tightly holding onto a wooden crutch. Despite the fact Charles X had yet to be officially crowned, she still called him king. Joan, Have I not said you do not need to kneel before me when it is just the two of us? I've also said to call me Charles on such occasions. If Lionel was here, he would likely once more be shocked. According to history, it was Charles who refused to give the order to save Joan when she was captured, leading to her execution. But the Charles of right now seemed to be almost fawning over the kneeling beauty. He was completely unlike the ungrateful king who abandoned her after getting what he wanted. Chapter 37. Joan, 2. After the first failure to recapture Paris, the history books wrote that Joan was insistent on trying again, while Charles was adverse to the idea after securing his throne. He felt that she had become too difficult to deal with, and as such made no attempt to take her back from the English. My king, we must maintain proper boundaries. You are my liege, and I am your humble servant. God has sent me to be your protector, your guardian. It is impossible for me to be your wife. God will not allow it, nor would the nobles. Whether or not God would allow it, Charles didn't know. But he was certain that she was correct about the latter portion of her words. They would turn a blind eye to him, taking her as a mistress. But a queen? France would burn before they allowed a commoner to hold such standing. It simply didn't matter how much Joan had accomplished for them. Charles's jaw set for a moment before he sighed. Take however many knights you need. I'll be awaiting word of your victory. Joan gingerly stood and bowed once more, sweeping a glance toward a dark corridor to the back left of the throne, and leaving without another word. The moment she left, a shadow stepped out from the corridor, making its way to the throne's side. Did I not tell you that when I'm meeting with her you aren't to be in the vicinity? What exactly do you mean by so flagrantly ignoring my commands, Pierre? Forgive me, my liege, but it is impossible for me to leave you with such a dangerous person. Punish me if you must. I am well aware of what you're doing. Leave. Do this again, and I will have you executed. My king, forgive me for saying so, but you cannot take this woman as your wife. You may think that this matter is only about her lineage, but this is not so. If she became your wife, would you allow her to go to the battlefield? If she carried your seed, would you allow her to charge toward the men of England? You are destined to be a king of legend. You must make decisions for the betterment of France. And would having a child that carries her blood and strength not be more beneficial than anything else? What if every king of France from now on wields her power? Would we not build an empire greater than Rome? Spare me. My king, you yourself already know that you've been blinded. Neither of Joan of Arc's parents had this strength, neither did her grandparents. It's impossible to say that this is hereditary. If my liege wants to take her as a bedmate, I will have nothing to say. If you'd also like to sire a bastard to test your theory, I will equally have nothing to say. But having thoughts of love, emotion, and sharing a life with this woman is simply impossible, my liege. Charles stayed silent for a long while, saying nothing. Finally, he opened his mouth to speak again. Leave me. Pierre bowed and obliged, slinking back into the shadows. He walked along the corridor, his expression cold and dark. He looked like a man made of darkness, his robes a deep black, his nose having an exaggerated arch, and his chin being incredibly narrow. After a moment, he really did disappear into the shadows. It wasn't an illusion or a feeling, but the objective reality. His body sunk into the ground, vanishing. When he reappeared, he was in a room dimly lit with candles, dripping of wax. 3 men lay sleeping upon slabs of rock. Upon his appearance, they stirred, almost mechanically sitting up. The Battle of Patay is a must-have victory for His Majesty. Go. Yes. The 3 men inexplicably slipped into the shadows as well. Pierre slowly walked across the room after they vanished, appearing by an altar with a closed black book. He stroked the cover almost affectionately, but also somehow simultaneously felt afraid to open up its pages. The bishop will lead us to glory. Our names will go down in Historia. A dark glow emitted from the book. Wandre G. Joan expressionlessly walked, leaning heavily on her crutch through the corridors of the main stronghold. Her face would sometimes flicker into a smile when she passed by someone, but the smile would just as quickly fade once she had passed. It took over a long, but she eventually made it back to the outer walls to find the very same 10 knights who had followed her out to greet Lionel and Ina. Get ready, she said plainly. This will be an important battle. Her smile was strikingly missing. Looking at her like this almost gave one a severe case of cognitive dissonance. Did those bastards make you angry again, sister? The knight who spoke got a sword hilt to the back of his head, causing him to cry out in pain. Is it time yet, sister? No, the time isn't ripe. Must we really continue to win battles for them? God has a plan, Michael. Believe in the bishop. When this is all over, our names will ring throughout history. We will be the ones who bring this forsaken earth closer to God. Joan grabbed her flag. A golden glow emitted from its pole, radiating out like rays of sunshine. She used her one good leg to pull herself onto her white steed, sitting tall with her smile once more back on her face. Chapter 38. Pate 1. Jean. Joan's delicate cry reached her knight's ears. Without needing more words, one of the 10 knights by Joan's side charged out from the group, taking with him a group of at least 50 cavalry. Lionel's gaze shifted to the flagpole in Joan's hands, but his face remained expressionless. He was certain that it was invisible to others, but he had very clearly seen a line of force leave Joan and enter Jean's body. In that instant, though it was difficult to get a read on Jean's stats since he was riding his horse, at the very least, his steed itself had a 10% increase in all of its physical stats. The army was riding through plains currently, but there was a forest up ahead. Seemingly realizing that something was wrong, Joan sent a squad of 50 as the vanguard. So that's Jean Potona, Lionel thought to himself, running alongside the horses with Ina by his side. Quite frankly, he wanted to ride a horse as well, but he simply didn't think he had the time to learn, so he hadn't even tried. According to history, Jean's action routed the English's sneak attack attempt and put them on their back foot. Because most of the hidden English forces were longbowmen, the losses were devastating and completely tilted the battle in their favor. This battle ended completely without a siege. But that is definitely not like Historia. Lionel's sharp senses caught wind of something odd hidden within the shadows of the vanguard cavalry. He had never seen something like it before, but it was more than enough to raise his alertness. As for Joan, she either hadn't noticed or pretended not to. Lionel found it too difficult to read her. In stride, Lionel pulled his atlatl from his hip, fixing a dart to it, and sending a line of silver piercing through the air. He was quite aware of the kind of discipline an army needed, and was even more aware of how frowned upon it was to act without the words of your commander. But Lionel was playing his role as a commoner. How would a commoner be aware of such things? His dart zipped through the air, causing a sharp intake of breath by the men still charging with him. The reason was that his throw was not only far too fast, but it went straight through the squadron of 50 as though without a care for their lives. Lionel wasn't focused on the reactions of fellow soldiers, though. His eyes were entirely focused on the white feathered dart. It soared through the air, narrowly missing several vanguard knights. Just before it left the group, it just passed over a slowly appearing shadow. As though startled, the shadow quickly ducked back into the ground, appearing as though nothing had changed. But Lionel's dart continued to fly, entering the forest of trees and leading to the pained cry of a hidden archer. As the leather-armored Englishman fell from the tree, several incredulous gazes made their way toward Lionel before a morale-infused roar washed over the Frenchman. Joan swept a glance toward Lionel from her white horse, but she received an innocent grin and a thumbs up in return. He looked no different from a kid happy to be of help for the first time. With that, any thought of reprimanding him she held vanished. The vanguard unit swept into the forest. It went without say that not every archer could hide away at the top of a tree. If this forest was so thick, it would never be on the route of their destination. Most of them tried to hide off the side of the path, waiting to rain down arrows after they passed through, but what they hadn't expected was such a prepared response. By the time Lionel's unit swarmed the forest, the English were in chaos. He swung his spear from his back, feeling a familiar burning in his blood. Ina trailed closely to his back. This sort of environment definitely wasn't the best for her battle style. That wasn't to say she couldn't fight. In fact, she could go through these trees like butter. The issue was how the other soldiers would deal with the trees falling in her wake. Taking this into consideration, she didn't act. Lionel didn't go out of his way to find and kill Englishmen. He took advantage of the complete disarray the battlefield was in to cut a straight line toward Jean's squad. Back when he threw that dart, those shadows had definitely peeked out of the ground several feet. Yet, no one but him seemed to notice. It made sense if a few didn't notice, or maybe even the majority, but not even a single person reacted. That only meant one thing: others couldn't see them. It must be the state they were in. In order to enter that shadow-like form, they're essentially becoming an amalgamation of force. But normal humans can't perceive force, and force wielders with weak senses can't see it either. Since the brain can't interpret what's right in front of it, the force becomes a blind spot. There was something that confused Lionel even more, though. Those shadows clearly hadn't had any malicious intent. In fact, that shadow in particular hadn't been targeting the knight, but rather the bowman hiding in the tree. Is that Joan's ability? Lionel and Ina flashed through the thin forest like two wisps of smoke. Their speed was faster than that of horses to begin with, so catching up with Joan's group hadn't been anything difficult. As expected, lying in wait on the opposite side of the ambush and outside the forest, there was another group of Englishmen waiting. But the disorderly, sorry-looking Frenchmen they were waiting for never appeared. Instead, Jean had perfectly formed up his squadron. Raising his pike and roaring, he charged, a bright golden glow surrounding his power. "In the name of God, for France!" The front line of the Englishmen was blasted apart by a force field-like force. Their foremen were thrown from their stances, suffering severe broken bone before the battle even truly began. Reality didn't deviate from history. In fact, with Lionel and Ina tacked on, the result was even more devastating. The Battle of Patay this time around wasn't just a resounding victory, it was a trouncing. And also, just like history, the following weeks continued the trend. The French army, under the leadership of Joan, swept through north-central France, leading a line of victories right to the gates of Reims where Charles VII would be crowned. In that time, Lionel and Ina became no less famous than any one of Joan's knights. Though they didn't wear the armor, nor have the steeds, their results were undeniable. Joan didn't even attempt to rein them in, allowing them to act freely within the armies as they saw fit. Barely over a month, several territories around Paris had fallen, and the threat of the Burgundians, traitor French of the last generation, fell along with the English. In just a few more days, Charles would be officially crowned in Reims, the very place the near fall of their nation started. Chapter 39, Patay, 2. Bonus Chapter 4, 200 Power Stones. Next bonus. Chapter 300. Lionel collapsed on a bed stuffed with hay. The last month had really been far too tiring. And, to make it worse, for fear of exposing himself to Joan as a person who knew much more than he should, he hadn't practiced O-dimensional cleanse at all either. This was on top of the fact that he hadn't eaten his fill even once in these past few days. That's Sedan. Lionel Morales. Strength, 0.95. Speed, 0.91 plus 0.9 plus 0.9 plus 0.1, partially nullified. Coordination, 1.99, 1.1 plus 0.05, nullified. Reactions, 1.05. Spirit, 0.3. Due to the fact Lionel was running obscene distances almost every day, the residual medicinal properties of his dad's smoothies began to eke out more and more, causing his strength, speed, agility, and stamina to take leaps forward. But this wasn't Lionel's greatest discovery. Since running from battlefield to battlefield was so monotonous, and there wasn't exactly great entertainment when they did rest, Lionel spent much of his time calculating the perfect positions for his next 8 force nodes. He came to realize over time that the more he used his ability, the stronger it seemed to become. In fact, the bump in his coordination and reactions was precisely due to this indirect increase. On top of this, due to this improvement, he found it hard to pin down his stamina with any sort of accuracy anymore, so he left it as a range. Because of his calculative mind, Lionel had the ability to make the movements of his body incredibly efficient. It was for this reason his ability impacted his coordination, and likewise his reactions. However, for the same reasons, it could also improve his stamina, but it varied depending on how much of his calculative abilities he focused on making his movements waste less energy. By now, Lionel was completely certain of the positions of his next 7 force nodes. He was only having a bit of trouble pinpointing where the last should be. "Are you two free?" The sudden words from a familiar voice at the entrance of his and Ina's tent caused Lionel to quickly sit up, sending a glance toward Ina, who was lying with her back facing to him. She happened to look toward him at the same time. The two hadn't exchanged many words since that day in the carriage. Lionel didn't exactly know how to feel about that, but what he did know was that he could trust her. "Yes, Michael? Did the scouts find something?" Michael lifted the curtain of their tent, poking his head in with a smile. "Nothing like that. Sister just wants to see you too. I'm not sure why, so don't bury the messenger in questions." "Oh!" Lionel perked up, playing the role of excited fanboy he always had. "Right away, then." Michael grinned. He had always liked Lionel's attitude. Much of the army found his naivete to be refreshing. Lionel had always been quite used to being well-liked through multiple social circles, so making new friends like this wasn't very difficult. He and Ina rose from their makeshift beds, following quickly after Michael. The army was housed in encampments on the outside of Reims, but the king who had traveled from Orleans here, and important officials were on the inside of the city. Lionel was surprised to find that Michael actually led the two of them into Reims itself. I guess it makes sense that she would stay inside the city. Charles couldn't allow the primary reason he regained this territory to muddle around with normal soldiers. Nay, Lionel didn't think much of it and was eventually brought to a mansion. The specifics about it he was uncertain of. Was she just lounging here? Was it rewarded to her? He didn't know. He could recall the main details of the timeline, but such small matters were long since forgotten by him. Michael left without a word, leaving Lionel and Ina to walk into an office area by themselves to find Joan turning around to greet them with a smile on her face. "Lionel, Ina, it's good to have you here. Have you been treated well?" Ina had learned to read and react to Lionel given certain clues. It was fine if she was a mute, but not understanding the language would be too suspicious. So, when Lionel nodded, her quick reaction time set in and she too nodded. That's good. Joan hesitated for a moment, causing Lionel's heartbeat to immediately slow. Well, it wasn't that his heart really did do this, but rather that he had subconsciously sharpened his reactions, causing even what was fast to be perceived far easier to him. "I have indeed called you two here for a very important reason." She took a deep breath and sighed. "I've been lying to the two of you for a very long time. For that, I apologize. I know more about our God-given abilities than I've told you. If you're willing to forgive me, I can take the two of you to meet the bishop. The archbishop?" Lionel's eyes lit up like a child, as though already forgiving Joan. "We get to meet him." Joan was stunned for a moment before smiling sweetly. "Yes, the archbishop." Lionel's supposed ignorance played through well. However, his mind was spinning. The importance of religious figures in this era couldn't be understated. The difference between a bishop and an archbishop was massive. Joan would never make such a mistake. That meant she meant to call out the title bishop. But who was this bishop that she was willing to allow Lionel to mistake for the archbishop? Was it a deliberate act of blasphemy? Or was she trying to spare his feelings by not calling out his ignorance? The archbishop is our true God-sent messenger. He is the one who leads my path and told me of my destiny. While he is in Reims prepared to crown our liege, I can take the two of you to meet with him. I thought I was alone in this world until I met the two of you. If you join our cause, then the bright future we hope for will be in a hand's grasp. Our names will resound through history." She seemed sincere. She really believes that she was the only one, so the shadows really must be her ability. That makes sense after all, they did nothing but help the entire way. Lionel excitedly nodded. Of course. Good, then follow me. I will take you there." Joan smiled and turned toward a bookshelf. As though straight out of a fantasy novel, she pulled on one of the spines and caused a doorway to open. These paths were tunneled under the city so that important religious figures and royals can escape in case of a siege. It'll be easier to take them than winding through the city for hours. Joan casually explained. "Wow. I didn't know something like this was possible. The archbishop really must be God's messenger." Joan smiled and led the way, completely missing Lionel's disappointed gaze as the bookshelf clicked closed behind them. He had said it himself before. Sometimes over-explaining revealed much more about the truth you wanted to hide. However, somewhat incredulously, he was certain that Joan meant them no harm. If she really believed she wasn't harming them, then who was this bishop? Where was she leading them? And which entity could create such a large network of underground tunnels in this era?